how the heifer was killed outside of the city and cleanses it from the sin. And then we find Christ as the third daughter. So might be interesting too. We're in a new setup. Our first Bible study that we filmed on Lori's new home, as Michelle mentioned earlier. Wherever we start picking back up, God blesses it. I know. Really leaning into God and to trust. All right, sisters, we're back with sharing our final thoughts on the book of Numbers. So join along with us. We have been sharing our daily readings of reading through the Bible for the second time in our locals community. The link is down below if you want to join along with that. We each have highlighted in our notes. We've been keeping each of us what we're tracking as we read through the Bible, and each kind of highlighted things that we want to discuss. Obviously, we're not going to talk about everything that's in the book of Numbers. There's a lot of other great resources out there that can do that. This is just Laura and I sharing things that stuck out to us as we're reading it through and things that we're tracking. We'll make sure we link that video down below. If you're like, what do you mean tracking? We'll link that down below so you can check it out. We're not going to get into that here. So the biggest thing that for me, reading through Numbers, I actually talked about this in the video when I realized this, and I didn't realize it when I first read it. It was a few days later reflecting back on it. So it was in Numbers 2. And I actually know the first time I read through it, I'll kind of show my notes here, I sketched out, hopefully it's coming out that well, and then I ended up doing it again once I came back to reflect on it. I noticed the organization of the camp, the way it was dividing, and I just thought it was very interesting. Like I said, I just quickly jotted it down, didn't really think anything of it. And at the same time, Laura and I are also in the process of updating our Matthew notes, and I came across an article that was going over just researching just patterns in Matthew. I'm also working on a document that I felt the Holy Spirit led me to create of the patterns and the unique things we learned about the book of Matthew that just kind of blown Lori and I away. So in this article, it was nothing to do with numbers until I was kept reading about patterns. And this was a different form of a chiasm, and they were going in and had a different name. I forget now what it was. But it showed this Numbers 2. I'm like, how did I not see this pattern? And I even, like I said, drew it out. So I went back and drew it out again after I went back to reflect on it. And the picture that on the article did a better job, but I don't want to copyright anyone else's work. So I did my best to myself create it. But with the camps, it forms a cross. And so I encourage you to go back and read Numbers 2, really study the different names of the camps. She'll try to get a little closer off my notebook. So anyway, I encourage you to go back. And then later on in the story, they also mentioned in this article, so when I got to read it, and actually too, Lloyd and I could try to switch off nights who films and shares what they're reading. So when it came to this chapter, it was in Balaam comes in and God gives him the vision. I forget what chapter that is. He even says that God gave him to see the beauty of the camp. It even says something like that. I had it marked too. And I just thought it was so here, Numbers 24. Yeah, Numbers chapter 24, Numbers, verses 3 through 5. It says, God opened his eyes and he saw the beauty and the tent. So this article will bring it up too. He saw the shape that they formed. It was a cross. Spirit helped him see more what God is doing. Yeah. That's what came through. And so when it was my turn, it was my night to read and share my chapter. And it was about that. And so I just thanks God because Lloyd and I shared in our first time learning, he just makes these certain connections, and it just really just touched me, and I cried, and when I sat with it, that even in the Old Testament, they may have understood, exactly what that meant, but right there, the way God designed Israel to camp around the tabernacle was in the shape of a cross. Speaking of Balaam, which is a whole long story, Laura and I are like, what? And then he gets 3 chapters. And so the author of Numbers really wanted us to understand this. But one thing obviously through in Balaam I thought was interesting. He wasn't an Israelite. He was an outsider prophet. But God, again, out of his grace and mercy to the Israelites, would not let him curse them. And again, he blessed them 3 times. I wrote just that this is our God. And God chooses the blessing for his people prevails. And I also, in contrast to what were they doing? What was his people doing? Right, not complaining to him. And the other thing about Balaam, so he wasn't an Israelite, so I also learned that he knew who God was. You saw that in those chapters. So again, it reminds me, the bigger story goes back to what we talked about in Genesis and stuff with Abram, like how other people knew who God was. So outside the Israelites, people knew who God was. So I always find that very interesting in the bigger picture of things. The other thing is that God speaks to them. So God not only speaks to the Israelites, but he also spoke to Balaam, which was not an Israelite. So I also sit with that too. But he seems God-fearing. Right. And that's what too, but later on in the chapter, you see that he ends up being killed went against God. So it was interesting. Something must have happened to Balaam, but we don't get all of those stories. But I just like sitting with those bigger pictures of this is who our God is. We have a God who speaks, a God who wants to bless us, to not just bless us. That's not like all that God is about, but just like, and he wants to keep the right relationship. He wants to work with his people. And so anyway, other thing that stuck out to me, other thing that I just saw again, the importance of the Levites. How they are always again set apart and how they belong to God, the firstborn. Yeah. So I always, when I see those, my brain always just goes to Jesus and that we are his and that we are set apart to be different as well. We even saw in Numbers 11, 17 through in 29 about the spirit, and I just wrote Moses wanting God's to put on there. I wrote that too, that stuck out to me, how Moses prayed. I wish everybody had God's Spirit. And here it is, what we all do as believers. After Pentecost, the Spirit comes to all believers. I wrote that down as well. Another interesting thing, I think it was in the Exodus one, you talked about a lot of things reminding you of John, but the signs, the glory. And that happens here too. Yeah, I made note of in chapter 14 here in Numbers. There's a lot of signs. Even verse 22 mentioned glory and signs. It mentioned, though, they have tested me 10 times. This is about God's talking to that generation. That he's the one that rescued them out of, Exodus, and they're the ones complaining they're not going to get to make it to the promised land. It's the next generation. I might just say it 10 times. 10 times. I overlooked that detail. The reason I brought that up, too, is that we also learned, again, going back into Matthew, the chapters 8 and 9 in Matthew are 10 healing stories. And a lot of people say it's in reference to against, like, Jesus' rearing and the 10 rebellions here. That's just, here it is. 10 times. So I just wanted to share that. Yeah, that's what hit me too out of chapter 14 was the glory of Yahweh appeared. What reminds me of Jesus. Because also we learned in Matthew, he says in chapter 14, verse 11 here in Numbers, Yahweh said to Moses, how long will these people spurn me? And how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have struck in their midst? And so after, again, Michelle and I've read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, all that just kept running through my head of that such similar language I've heard in all those Gospels. Jesus is like, I'm giving you all the signs. You're not believing me. How long do I have to be with you people type of idea? So, that just came through me when I was reading that chapter for sure. How you can see here also in these chapters of Numbers, God is preparing his people for the promised land. He wants them pure. He wants them holy. He wants them set apart. So you see these judgments happening to them, but you also see God's also not just judging and giving judgment to the Israelites, but he's also giving judgment to a lot of the other outside nations as well. So it kind of shows I saw that that's who God is too. He's a God of justice. And to me, kind of ties into a little bit, I feel, to my righteousness tracker, that righteousness is to be made right and to make things right. To do so, I just sat with that too in terms of like that judgment, making things right and always. Yeah, we don't might always understand it or get it, but that's something that came through me. But not only Lori and I do we share things that are just kind of interesting or just cool connections that we just really appreciate, but we also like to share things that we aren't really sure on. One was a little about the Balaam story, like why it's a story in there, besides learning that we see the goodness of God in contrast to us. There must be some other chiasm or pattern that we just haven't seen yet. Yeah, but I also just made note here and end of chapter 16. I just thought it was all very interesting, kind of how it ends from verse 47 all the way to the end of 50 and talks a lot about making atonement. The plague has begun, and then it says there that Aaron stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was halted. So to be honest, this is one of those things I just put a big question mark. What is this? What is going on? To be honest, I will admit I don't understand what plague is happening. But just that the plague has begun, and then later on there's mentions of other plagues. But I'm like, but here it said the plague stopped. So there are different plagues happening. And then just how Aaron atoned for the people and it stopped. I don't know if that's any foreshadow to Jesus as well. I'm not sure if anyone has made that connection, but atonement is something I'd been tracking and the sin and blood and stuff. So I just thought this was interesting, this whole scene, what was happening. Well, I just got what I made note when I studied it a little bit deeper. Again, Michelle and I aren't doing deep studies, but when something interests us, if we have time to, we go up on the side. Yeah. But after following what happened in chapter 16, you see the authority of the priesthood was being questioned. And God was like, okay, so that's what happened before. So here we see God is going to give clarity to the people of his divinely appointed Aaron and his sons and to the priests. So I think, and all that ties in a little bit. That he's like, okay, you've been questioning my choices and my authority of who these priests are. I'm going to show you their authority and give you clarity So you think by Aaron standing in the middle between the dead and the living, the like stop was showing God's power through his priests. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, like through Aaron, yeah, the priest. Yeah, it stopped when Aaron came into the doorway. I don't know. I mean, I know God works through people, and I do know the priest had a big role, and God, was trying to show his people. Yeah, so to say that was just one area that I was like really confused on. Chapter 19, you go into the red heifer, which we know that ties into a lot of different people's end times theology, and we're not going to get into all that. I just wrote about the red heifer, symbolizes obviously the ultimate sacrifice of Christ who purifies us from our sin. I wrote have to find my other notes, like, heifers are red, that stands for something. So anyway, and how the heifer was killed outside of the city and cleanses it from the sin. And, maybe a foreshadow there too, also to Jesus doing that at the same for us. I also just made note, there was a mention, this lost where it was. Again, the salt of the covenant. I know that's something we mentioned before. Numbers chapter 18, verse 19, it says permanent covenant of the salt, which is something else, Lord. I learned as we updated our Matthew notes that when Jesus brought up that you're the salt and light of the world, we learned that salt also is a reference to the covenant. And here I just like making reference still to that there. Also, another thing I just made note of in chapter 27, hold on before you get to chapter 7, back in chapter 18, I know I jumped ahead to chapter 19 with the red heifer, but just wrote the red heifer, why is it red? A color to shadow forth both the bloody nature and the complexity of sin. Back in, I guess in the book of Isaiah, he references the sin to be a scarlet or red. And also to the blood of Christ is our sacrifice. No blemish was also honed in on that. But then going back to chapter 18, you see that it's reviewing the laws of the Levites and how the priests had a special role. And then the Levites were there to support the priests. So I just made note that, is that kind of like how we are the body of Christ today? Like, we are all part of Jesus's church, but we all have certain roles and support systems, I don't know. That might mean nothing, but that's just something. I think so. I also just made note, going back to what I was saying earlier about chapter 27. I just said this also reminded me of John 10, verse 15. In it, or 27? 27, chapter said in verse 15. So Moses appealed to the Lord. May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all, appoint a man of the community who will go out before them and come back in before them, and who will bring them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's community won't be like sheep without a shepherd. And that made me think of John 10 about Jesus leading us. And then the next verse is Joshua. The Spirit later, which is again, I know, foreshadow of Jesus. So I really liked that part of that. Yeah, also you see in chapter 26 of Numbers is a second census. So because the previous children, right? The previous generation had the first census and were all died in the wilderness. Now this is the second group of people 38 years later. And they're getting, again, you see that these couple chapters are about God preparing them to enter into the promised land. Chapter 27 is an interesting story. It has these mentions of these daughters, and then how it ends, right? Right. So this is, again, something Michelle and I we get, but we're not really sure if we get. I looked up an article from the Bible Project on it, and what they were just saying is that this is also showing us that not everything in God's law is clear cut, that he does call us for wisdom, and the articles mentioning this was showing that, that the laws of God don't give us laws for every single thing that we're going to experience in our life, and to use wisdom. And this was supposed to be an example. So I got this from somebody else off YouTube. I thought it was interesting, so I'll share it with you. But the names of all these daughters were interesting as well. Some people compare these 5 women to the 5 virgins that Jesus talks about. I didn't really look too more into that, but I'm sharing that for anybody else who wants to dive deep into that. But the names of the daughters mentioned here, the first one, I'm definitely not going to say the names right, but I'll do my best. Mala means infirmity. Noah means wandering. Hogla, turning about or dancing for joy. Malek, queen, and Tarza, more pleasing or acceptable. And then if you also learn the father's name, his name was, I guess, this idea of the shadow of fear type of idea. So this guy needs mentioned something to sit with. We were all in the bondage of fear, kind of like the father, of death and everything. But through Christ, we have hope from that. So if you take the first daughter's name, her was the infirmity. So we have the infirmity, the fear, the sin and stuff. Then the second girl's names were wandering. Like, we're all wandering around before we meet Jesus. Like, what's going on? Like, all this, the idea of wandering for help and for comfort. And then we find Christ, which is the third daughter. We turn around. We dance with joy now. And Jesus is royalty, so he makes us royalty as well. So we're the fourth daughter who's the queen, and then the fifth one, we're pleasing and acceptable. Now through Jesus, we are acceptable in the sights of God. And so I don't know, I like it. I can see how it kind of flows and makes sense for a deeper meaning and level. Well, I know that a lot of the names in the Hebrew Bible, their names also imply something about the story for us to take away. So yeah, I like sitting with that for sure. Yeah. And then also with Moses not being able to enter the promised land, it's just a great reminder, even though he was mentioned a couple times as a super humble leader. I also just like sitting with, like, he was a sinner like the rest of us, needing a savior like the rest of us too. So, and it helps highlight Jesus, the new Moses to come, the better one, and even more who is sinless himself. Also, like I said, we didn't get to cover everything in it. We also know a lot about it. A lot of people have a hard time with God going and killing certain nations. And I was listening to another person, the one I like to listen to, Jamie Winship, and happened to listen to one random one, and he kind of brought that up. And because he was going over the Exodus, and he was mentioning he don't really look at all the names of those tribes as people groups. It's more of like a way societies run, their way their politics, their economics, like all of that stuff. God was saying, you're not taking the world that way, that world were into my land. You're going to follow my ways, the way I do economics and, all that stuff. So I just like sitting with that too. I know a lot of people wrestle with that. A lot of other great scholars have talking about that. I just that was something just recently in my mind. I just wanted to share. Like Lloyd said, there's more on that idea. We could get into a lot. The similarities from the New Testament to the Old Testament and the New vice versa. I see that more every time I read the Bible. I see my brain, the Spirit leads me to make different connections or notice something differently that I sit with differently. So I love all of it. And so I'm listening to, we're in a new setup. The first Bible study that we filmed on Lori's new home. And the Lord blesses us that we can do many more Bible studies as we come. Hopefully in a room set up one day. Right now, we don't have one. So we're kind of just making do, going with it till we actually had to put a pause on our Bible reading because we've been doing so many other things. It's always there. We're going to get back into it. That's the one thing we also want to share with you, the raw journey of, like, we had to take about 2 weeks off. I think it was 3 weeks. Maybe 3 weeks doing our nighttime reading. So we do plan on getting back into it. But we also just want to show you life happens. We're not shamed for it. We don't feel guilty for it. It kind of ties back into how God really transformed Michelle and I's minds around working out and eating and stuff. That it's not we did anything wrong or bad. We just pick it back up when we get. So we hope that's an encouragement to you if you kind of you started reading your Bible with the idea of reading it, every night. Maybe something happened and you got off course. Like, to us, it's not really you got off course because, as Michelle mentioned earlier, wherever we start picking back up, God blesses it. And it's amazing the connection later on that comes into. So I hope that's also an encouragement too. It's never a waste of time. You're never off the rails because in God's eyes, you're always where you need to be, and just to keep trusting the process. So. Yeah, and also we hope this also shows you guys that just because Lauren and I do share our Bible studies publicly, we don't want you to think like think we're so much better because we don't have a perfect schedule. We do our best. And that's also why we've been sharing our journey in locals. Like I said at the beginning, Moy and I have been sharing our daily check-ins of reading through the Bible over in our locals community. It's down below. We're going to get ready to start the next book, which will be Deuteronomy, to finish out the 5 books of Torah. And then again, we're just going to continue reading for simplicity. Next book. Again, we'll link to all the other previous Bible study videos we did discussing our plan and our previous reading through the whole Bible if you were new to us. And other than that, sisters, see you in the video. We don't know when it'll be. Again, as we saw Lori's video announcing her new home and stuff, we don't know our current schedule. We're just doing our best of honoring what we're handling in our life, because I also have other things going on in my life. Don't know when helping Lori. So we just have a lot of things that we're really leaning into God and to trust. So that's right. All right. We love you guys. We'll see you in the next one.